coming to you from inside my kitchen, my bakery. It's my house. It's a separate kitchen from where I make my bigger messes. This is where I do all my testing, where I've taught some classes, where I write my cookbooks. So I wanted to share with you my little space and some pie dough demo. And I know that a lot of you have a hard time with pie dough. It's not easy as pie, but it can be. And one of my favorite things to teach are doughs, laminated doughs, pie doughs, just because they're so stinking delicious and people have a lot of trouble with them. So I'm going to grab some ingredients, and where I'm grabbing them from is kind of key to what we're doing. So I'm going to my refrigerator and to my freezer where I'm keeping some. So on a day like today that's hot, it's even more important to do this, but I just took my blade from my food processor from my freezer along with my flour. So that was in my freezer. And now I'm going to jump to my refrigerator and grab my very cold butter. So everything cold. This is essential for pie dough. It is. So in here I have 2 cups of all-purpose King Arthur flour, which has a higher gluten content than most all-purpose flours, and it's very useful for providing structure in the pie dough. I also add salt, and this is a friend of mine who used to work over at Better Homes and Gardens. Whenever she read my recipe, she'd go, "Ah, there's Gesine salt," because you need to season sweet stuff as much as you do need to season savory stuff, because salt brings out the flavor. Not too much, just enough to bring out the sweetness and bring out the buttery taste, which leads me to butter. So I'm making an all butter pie dough today. I'm fine with cutting butter with a little bit of shortening if you want a tender pie dough. I just ask that you not use salted butter. And I'm going to pulse this really quickly. This is the flour, the sugar, and the salt. I just want them to be well combined. And I'll take this off again. So you'll see I have, this is 2 sticks of butter that I've just cut up into cubes. It is ice cold. You can also keep it in the freezer, which is fine with me. And I just scatter it about into my food processor. And they're relatively big chunks, right? Because I'm going to pulse this a few times to get them smaller, and so that it looks like lumpy cornmeal. I still want to see those nice big pieces of butter incorporated into the dough. And it's important everything is cold, because if the butter's warm, if the room is too warm and your flour is warm, then as you're pulsing, the butter will start melting. And that means the moisture in the butter is going to start getting absorbed by the flour too early. So you'll lose some of the butter, the moisture in the butter you'll lose that causes lift in the flakes, and you'll have a tough crust. So keeping everything cold allows the butter to stay uniform and not to melt, so that once you roll it out, you'll see those individual pieces of butter that are so important for a nice and flaky crust. So if you have any questions as we're going along, ask away. I don't know where this thing went. I have no idea. So I'm always like this, going there. So I'm gonna pulse. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then I shimmy, because flour always gets right here. And so I check it after 10. And I don't know if you can see, but there are still large chunks of butter that I can break up a little, but it's getting there, right? They're getting smaller. They're becoming pea size, which is what I like to see. So I'm going to go back, already making a mess. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Shimmy. Let's see. This is looking nice. So, nice small pieces of butter, but still big enough that I can see them, that they will make a statement in our crust. They will be in there. They'll be in it to win it. So now it's time for the water portion. And if you have converted some of your pie recipes in using vodka, that's fine. Using a small measure of vodka goes a long way in a tender crust because what it does is it doesn't contain a lot of water, which produces gluten, but you still get a moisture that brings the crust together. So let's do a half a cup of water, and I'm going to do a scant half cup. That's a scant half cup because it's a little humid today, and that'll make a difference in your pie dough. It'll make a difference in your bread dough. That if you are incorporating moisture into a dough, you'll notice that in the wintertime you'll need a little more because it's so dry out. And today I just noticed I've been making pie dough all day, and I noticed that I don't need quite as much. Oh, I've got a question. My husband was doing this. Question.
You gotta get together. You find that, this is from Liz.
Yep, Liz.
Do you find that making pie dough by hand produces a better crust versus the food processor, or does it not matter?
It does matter. I feel this makes a better crust. Making it by hand has a lot of variables that are bad for a crust. First of all, your digits are hot. I've got really bad circulation, so I've got baker's fingers. I've got cold fingers. I'm lucky that way. But when it comes to pie dough, when it's a small amount and you're doing it really quickly, I prefer a cold blade doing more uniform chunks of butter so that they stay larger. And the cold blade makes easy work of it too. Now you could use a lot of people have a pastry tool. That's fine for pie dough. You could do that, chill it first so that it doesn't get hot as you use it. That's not such a big deal, but you can totally do that as well. I just prefer the uniformity and the pieces that the blade of the food processor create. But you can use a pastry tool for that. You can also use 2 knives and do it that way. It just takes a lot longer. But the lovely thing about this is that you have uniformity in the butter going through. You also start seeing that the butter is getting just slightly coated with the fat, which creates a tender crust as well, but not so much. So if you're using your hand, you tend to coat the flour more with the fat. So I find this is my preferred way. If you want to do it by hand with tools, that's cool too. It's fine with me. So now I'm going to add ice cold scant half cup of water. I always add a little bit of lemon juice, and I'm going to take that seed out. Get out of there. And so I use the, this is going to be the most challenging. We're going to stop that from going in. Are we? So now I start pulsing, and I slowly add the water in. And I move it around because I find that if I go back and forth and side to side, I get more uniform saturation. And let's watch that seed. Can we stop it from go? Can we stop it? Yes, ma'am. Boop. There it is. Okay, one more pulse. Get rid of our water. So here's where it all gets fun. Now, sometimes you'll look at this and you'll say to yourself, that's too dry. That's not going to hold together. Here's the test. Before you look at this and say too dry, do a pinch test. Does it hold together when you pinch it? Yes. Don't add more water just because it's not coming together and immediately like coalescing into a dough. That can often lead, and most often leads, to tough crust because people think they want it to look like dough right away, so they just go crazy and they keep adding water. Stop. You don't need to. Collaborate and listen. Okay, so now I'm going to get some saran wrap. And I do several layers because I'm going to do a little technique that I call, it's a very technical term, smushing. And if you're one of my students, I always describe things as smush because it's an action with your hands. But in pie dough, there's actually a word for it in French. It's called fraisage. And it's this technique of not really kneading, but of incorporating the butter more fully into your dough to create flakiness. Now, this is unlike lamination in that we're not going to do a bunch of folds and incorporate huge chunks of butter into the dough. But what we are doing is that the chunks that exist in here, some of them are going to be too large and be too independent. So fraisage, or my technical term, smushing, allows you to cause streaks. So traditionally, you would put more flour on the table, use your heel and press out, and then fold it and press some more. I don't like to incorporate more flour than I already have in the recipe. I also know that I'm going to use this saran wrap to refrigerate my dough. So I use my smush method, and I go smush. And I go smush. And this is also a way of getting it into that lovely disc that you want. Smush. And so I'm actually using my knuckle sandwich to make this happen instead of the heel of my hand. So if you were to see a more traditional method, it would be smush like that, and then you bring it back in and you fold it. So if you are familiar with laminated doughs, you're doing a little bit of folding. You watch it come in, smush, watch it come in, smush. And the other thing I like about this method is protecting the dough from your hot hands, because I know you're all hot stuff. And also, if some of you crazy people have knuckle hair, and that's okay, it's fine. But you know, knuckle hair in your pie dough, not so good. It protects dough from knuckle. So what I do now is I cover the dough. And I do another little smush just to make sure it's nice and cohesive, so when I roll it out, it'll be good to go. And I'm going to refrigerate this for 20 minutes. This needs to rest. We've given this a little workout. Think of muscles. Resting allows the muscles to relax. This allows the gluten to relax. So when you roll it out, it stays rolled out. So if you've ever decided that you're too impatient and you want to roll out something really, really quickly and it starts shrinking back, it's because the gluten's been activated. It needs more rest time. If it's really hot, question? I'm going to put this in the refrigerator. Ask away.
Michelle asks,
Yes, Michelle.
have you ever made a savory dough adding seasonings? If so, will it alter the consistency?
Yes and yes. So this can easily be made savory. You can use it as is, and it will be perfect for quiche or whatever. You can cut back on the sugar. This uses a tablespoon of sugar to 1 teaspoon, and that won't alter it as far as savory goes. What it does is it adds nice caramelization when it browns. And then you can, as you are rolling it out, you can add herbs, or you can add them in the pulsing process, dry herbs, and it's gorgeous. And I've done it, and it's tasty, and I recommend it for all savory things. And that's the nice thing about pie dough, is it goes both ways. It's both sweet and savory, like us. Okay, so now I'm going to pretend that that dough is done and done. So that was a single batch. And let's talk about batching. So for a traditional, relatively shallow pan, 1 batch of this that I just made will be good for a double crust for a more shallow pan, a pan like this. I really love this pan for several reasons. I'll go into that later. But this is perfect for a shallow pan. So if you're going to start getting deeper and more crusty, I suggest making 2 batches. And these are different kinds. This is a lovely King Arthur flour pan. Allows for heat distribution with these little thingies over here. And then you get to the ceramics, which are gorgeous, right? They're perfect when you're going places and you want to present a beautiful pie in a beautiful dish. The problem with ceramics is that it's much harder to get a really well done bottom when you're doing a double crusted pie and not blind baking the bottom. So you're going to get a soggy bottom, period. You're no luck. These thinner pans distribute heat more readily, so this one even has little pinprick holes. I think it's aluminum, and I can understand not feeling great about using aluminum, but even the pie plates that are also aluminum in your grocery store are actually very good for this, and you can make little holes in there so that you can get distribution of heat throughout. And these are great for double crusted pies when you want to do great work on the sides of crimping, and you don't blind bake the bottom, and you get a better chance of getting a nice brown bottom and not a soggy bottom. But I prefer nice presentation and a crispy bottom. So this is what my technique is. I will dust my work surface. This one is cute. I forgot a rolling pin. And then I will cut off. And because I'm using the larger pan, I'm not using the smaller one, I'll cut off about 3/4 of the dough, and I'll have a little left over for decoration if I want to do that on top of my double crusted. And first I'll do a little more smushing. Any more questions? Ask away. We are doing pie dough at Free Grace, which is my bakery, in my home. In any minute now you might hear a rooster crowing, saying he contributed to this somehow if I'm using eggs in the process. He didn't make the eggs, his ladies did, but he likes to take all the credit. So grab a pen. And then we'll just start doing a little rough work. You can see how this isn't the perfect shape because I cut a piece of it off. So if your hands are nice and cool, that's fine. You're not going to do any damage. But I'm going to start rolling as well as I can into the shape of a round.
Liz has a question.
Liz, ask away.
How do you feel about Pyrex pans?
I actually like Pyrex pans, and I do have quite a few of them my own. I hold the same rule for them as I would a ceramic pan, in that they are better for blind baking bottom crusts, or crusts where you don't have a top crust at all, where you would put a filling in them, like a curd or a pastry cream. What's extra nice about Pyrex is that you are able to see the bottom as you're baking. So what you can do is that if you are really worried about your bottom crust not being all that crispy as it should be, you can quickly take out the oven, check the bottom out. And if it's not browning well enough, you can just put a little bit of tin foil over the top so that doesn't over brown, and just keep it riding on the bottom until it gets to the color that you like. So that's actually what I really do like about Pyrex. There are lots of things to like about Pyrex. They're just great little pans. Wasn't Pyrex made by NASA? Wasn't that like NASA technology at work? I'm pretending that it is, to make it even more special, because why not? I know Velcro was, right? Velcro, Tang, not so much. Okay, so I'm just going to keep going. Loose Sturpy. If you have any questions, ask away. So, I don't know if you can see. Let's do some dusting, baby. So, other tip. I always keep 2 pastry brushes. One that I will use liquids on, like for brushing egg wash, and one that I will never use liquids on, only flour, just to keep it nice and supple and clean and sanitary. So let's see what this looks like. Now you can see, look at these little chunks of butter. Do you see that coming through? So that's where our smear did some nice jobs. And that's where the flake will come from. Another little tip-ski I have for you, that if you are one of those people that is hell-bent on getting a double crust with crimped edges, where you crimp together the bottom and the top crust, one other way of managing soggy bottoms is to do something that I call crust dust. It's an even measure of flour and sugar, and I keep it in a jar. So a cup of flour and a cup of sugar, I whisk it together, and then I will put about a tablespoon, just a dust, on the bottom of my pie crust, so that it kind of acts as a barrier between any really juicy filling and the crust itself, so that the crust has a better chance of getting nice and crisp before that juice has a chance to really get in there and make it soggy. And as you probably already know, flour is a thickener, so it starts acting as a thickener for all those juices that would otherwise penetrate your lovely crust.
Tuffy's watching.
Is Tuffy? Tuffy! Tuffy! Tuffy's the cat that my friends, the Hales, were camping. They weren't my friends yet. They were camping in this area, and Tuffy the cat, he got sick of being in a camper, so he ran away, and he lived under a barn for close to a month, which is kind of amazing for a cat from Florida living in Vermont in a barn for a month. And I finally captured him, and I had the pleasure of having Tuffy as my roommate back in my mudroom for a good month or so, I think. And then the Hales came and picked him up, and I've missed him so much that I'm now adopting 2 feral cats that I think are being socialized, so that I can actually pet them like I pet Tuffy. So I like to use scissors to cut my edges of the pie. So what I do, and often, another tip, it's usually not that big of a problem if you've got a nice amount of butter in your pie dough, but if you have baker's spray, that nonstick spray, it's sometimes really nice to spray your pan before you put in the dough, because sometimes juice will seep in there and really make that bottom crust stick. So that's totally legit to spray your pie pan.
Questions.
Question?
Kara wants to know what's your favorite pie to make for your family?
It changes with the season. Apple pie, my Ray loves apple pie. And he always says, whenever I make it, he goes, you never make me apple pie. I'm like, I'm making you one now, Ray. Also banana cream pie, because Ray likes banana cream pie. And then in late summer, it's Zwetschgendatschi, which is a Bavarian pie that uses Italian plums or Damson plums. And if you know them, the plums, they are so fleetingly in season. And it's such a traditional Bavarian tart that my mom made every year. And just the smell of it reminds me of her. So it's a tradition in our family to make it. It's incredibly delicious, but it's one of those things, as probably all of you know, baking is such a memory maker. The smells that come from your oven, just, you know, tasting that thing that you only have once a year because it's so special, like Christmas stuff or Hanukkah, or something like the Damson plum tart, when you can only get those plums like for a week out of the year. But it is so evocative of my mother that for me at this time of year, I'm so looking forward to getting those plums and just smelling the tart baking in the oven, because it's Helga, it's my mom, and you know, it's nice to have her around when she's up in heaven and hopefully making things go well for me. Go, Mom.
Sarah has a question.
Yep, go ahead.
For the Pyrex, could you put the pie in a lower oven rack at the end to crisp up the bottom?
Why, yes, you can. As a matter of fact, I've even put, depending on where your heat source is, so some heat sources aren't at the bottom of your oven, but if it is, I've like kept it off the rack entirely and literally put it on the bottom of a very hot oven to crisp that up. Very good point. Well done.
Monica has a question.
Monica, ask away.
How do you prevent the dough from sliding down when baking?
Oh, we will be good. I'm so glad you asked that question. So we're getting to that point now where I would be telling you about shrinkage of dough. So first, when I blind bake, which I tend to do because I like crispy crusts, which you should do when you're using a ceramic pie dish, even with a double crust, and I'll show you how I get away with that with the edges. So I always make sure that my edges go, I don't crimp where I cut, because I want that to be nice and flaky. If you pinch that, then it won't expand. And you want everybody to know how flaky your crust is. So I just make sure, dab, 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 that the crust does indeed hit the sides. One thing you can do if you want to guarantee that no shrinkage, you cannot cut this until it comes out of the oven. So you literally let the dough hang over and act as a weight as you bake it. And then when you take it out, you can just cut it off, use a knife to scrape it off. It doesn't create really clean edges, but it works perfectly for no shrinkage. What I like to do, if I'm really worried about my dough for some reason, sometimes you get this feeling this dough's not going to be happy, I will put just a little bit of milk along this edge, just on the edge. Make sure it doesn't slide in the bottom, but little milk all along here, and just gently adhere the crust to it, and it will stay. It acts like a little bit of glue. When you're about to serve the pie, don't forget that you've done that, and just take your pie triangle or your knife and just go like this underneath to release it, because it will have stuck, and that's why it didn't shrink. What I do for all my pies is I get a piece of parchment, and this one I've used before, so you can see it's been nice and seasoned. And I don't make it too large. I want it just large enough that when I put it in there, there's enough overhang that I can lift out my weights, but not so much that it crimps over and starts making impressions in the dough, which sometimes it'll get baked in and you'll take off the parchment and a part of the crust will come off. That's so fun.
Sandy has a question.
Yeah, ask away.
How thick do you roll your crust out?
So let's see, what is this? This is about a 1/4 inch thick, between an 1/8 and a 1/4 inch thick. I am, for my flaky pie dough crusts, I am a big fan of crust. I don't know what that is. But I tend to do it more thickly than I would say a sweet tart dough or a pâte brisée, where kind of thin is the rule. But for this, I really like crust. So about a 1/4 inch thick. So you can go between an 1/8 and a 1/4. But enough that you have some play when you lift the pie, that it's got some structure. Okay, so this is what I keep for my pie weights. It's a combination of rice and beans. Rice and beans. And I just pour it in. And I pour a lot in. So first I tamp it down, and I want to make sure that my parchment is tall enough that the rice and beans don't get cooked and fall in and cook into the crust, which has happened. I have also in the past at somebody else's house not been able to find any kind of pie weight, and I use dog food. It's not a good idea. I use dog food. So I keep going up until it hits the very edge. So this creates a weight, right? All along that edge that will keep, and do it as far up as you can without the rice and beans actually falling in between the parchment and the dough and getting stuck in there. So that's a weight that will keep that crust like this going and stuck on there and not shrink. It can't shrink a little, and it probably will, but there is another method of 100% guarantee. So I'm gonna put this in the oven about 10 to 12 minutes, depending on how your oven runs. So I have it at 350. And I'll put it in there.
Question
Yes,
from Mary.
Mary, ask.
Do you run 20 miles a day since you bake such delectable pastries?
I'm going to say yes and totally lie. No, I don't. I used to run a lot more than I do now, but we do go for miles a day. And when I'm training for a marathon, once a week I'll run 20 miles a day. But yeah, you just have to, if you bake every day, sometimes you're like, it's my work, I'm not going to eat it. But that's actually a rare occasion. I just have to make sure I'm not shoving everything in my face. I also have to make sure it has a place to go. Like if you're feeding people, it's a good way of not eating everything. Okay, so here's my other trick. So let's pretend I lined this with a pie dough as I did before. If you saw, I docked it. So I take a fork, I go boop, and make holes all along the bottom of the dough. So like this. Here's the dough, and I go like this, docking. And what that does is it creates a hole between the bottom of the pan, your heat source, and the top, and it allows extra circulation. So now we've had our pie dough over our gorgeous pan. Pretend it's there. I'll put parchment on top. And then I put a like-sized, heavy pie tin on top of it. So this would have parchment. And you would have trimmed it just as I did before. And you would turn this over onto a parchment-lined sheet pan, and you bake it upside down. Gravity is your friend. What it will do is it'll keep that pie crust from shrinking, because it can't. It's got gravity making it, you know, stay there like little skirts weighted down. The biggest problem with this, as you can imagine, is that your pie is now upside down. You have a sheet pan, hopefully on top of it. If you don't put a parchment-lined sheet pan underneath, you want something that will be able to hold the crust if it's leaning on the parchment. Otherwise, it can actually drop off into the bottom of your oven. What is that thing called that's on? My oven. So when you get it out, it's hot, and you want to turn it right side up. So what I would do is I would put first on oven mitts, and then you can slip your hand underneath and just flip it over, or you can put another sheet pan over it, and then because sometimes it makes you just feel better that you've got something that's not so hot. And you flip the two together, and you flip it right side up again.
Beth has a question.
Yep, Beth, ask.
Would you dock a dough you would fill and not bake blind beforehand?
No. And you probably know why. So if you're going to fill the dough, and it actually depends on the filling. If it's a very liquidy filling, no. If it's a relatively stable and thickened filling, you can. In that case, I would also put down a layer of crust dust, which is that equal measure of sugar and flour that I mix together and keep in a jar, and put about a tablespoon down, and that will allow you still to get some of that circulation. But if you think about it, when you're blind baking, you don't have a filling, you have the weights in there, but I take the weights out eventually and let it bake some more, free and easy. But when the weights are in there, that circulation really isn't getting much play, right? Because you've got a weight on it. Same goes for filling, so I don't think you're getting much benefit from docking it if you're immediately going to put filling in there. In that case, I would, though, try to get a pan that is more like this one, that's thinner, metal, that allows for circulation, and this one has holes in the actual pan that will allow for that circulation without jogging the dough. Make sense? And this is old school. I got this at a old antiques mall, and it's just a cool little thing to display on the wall too. And I actually use them. But again, as I was saying before, if you're going to make a double crusted pie, one batch of the pie crust is perfect for this size. I do 2 for a deeper and wider pan. So now I have presumably blind baked my pie crust. So you can see the little docking at play. And this is what I go for. I go for a little browning on the edges. I put it in there with the weights for about 10 minutes. I take out the weights and I keep it in there until the bottom crust loses that raw dough sheen. So it doesn't have to brown. I just want to see where those bubbles, where it looks like that top has had a nice chance of getting some baking through. So this is blind baking, where you're not baking the whole thing through. You're not par baking, where it's set. That would be for yeasted doughs as par baking. It's when you bake it long enough that it doesn't brown, but it does set. This is blind baking, where it's kind of blind. You're doing it for as many minutes as you need to get it to this situation.
Joni has a question.
Joni, ask away.
When do you take the weights out? And how long do you bake the crust after taking the weights out?
After 10 minutes, I take off the weights, and I do it very carefully. We'll do it in a little minute here when that's done. And then I put the pie back in for about 5 to 10 minutes. That's why it's blind baking. You're doing it blind. It varies for different ovens and different people. You keep it in there just long enough that you get that raw dough sheen to go away from the dough. You could actually do it for a little bit longer. In that case, you just have to watch the edges because they tend to brown more quickly, and you don't want them to be too brown.
Joan just wrote, never mind, you already answered. And so now we're going to call security on her.
It's okay, Joni. It's okay.
Security.
That's what I'm here for. Hey, we don't know. People could just be joining us and going, who are you? Where are you? What are you doing? And we're in my bakery kitchen where I do all my recipe testing and my cookbook writing, and sometimes I teach in here, and I just have a lot of fun.
Sherry's watching from Charlotte, North Carolina.
Hello. If you have any questions, ask away. We have just blind baked the bottom crust. Whew, it's getting warm in here. And now we're going to start doing some filling and some top crust work after having already blind baked the bottom, which is kind of confusing to people because they say, then how does it look pretty? Well, we're going to turn the air conditioning back on.
You can open the window. Oh, you can do that too.
If the air conditioning's too loud, yell. I'll yell.
The sound doesn't work really well.
So here's an example of a double crusted pie that I blind baked beforehand. You can see the edges. And the edges are relatively clean, so it doesn't lack that crimping. But because I wanted to give it some zhuzhing, I know, they're fall. That's a little depressing with the maple leaves and acorns. But it is getting there, kids. So you'll notice that there's more browning around the edges because I actually put an egg wash on it. And here it's a little lighter that I did not egg wash. So you can see that it's got a little bit of browning, but not a lot. Baked for the same amount of time, so it shows you what a little egg wash can do. But this was a apple pie. This is a type of double crust with a blind baked bottom. And so we're going to do a berry pie now with frozen fruits with a lattice.
Michelle
Yes?
has a question.
Michelle, ask away.
Because this will be good for this. When you use fresh fruit,
Yeah.
how do you account for the extra moisture, especially when doing a double crust?
Well, here we go. So if you're using fresh fruit, and it depends on the type of fruit, with apples, I like to saute them first with some sugar and some thickener. And what that allows you to do is to thicken the juices. So if you've ever made a double crust apple pie and you've not sauteed the apples first, you see this big dome on the top, and then you're slicing into the apple pie and you're like, what the? And the apples have shrunk because they're full of juice, and the juice evaporates, it thickens, it gets it soggy. So you've got this big gap between crust and apple. So in order to avoid that, I saute them first till they're just a little soft, and everything thickens, the juice, the caramel, and so that way you can see there's none of that gap. The crust is actually touching the apples, And you haven't done away with the juices. You've thickened them enough that it works with the crust and the filling. I hope that makes sense. With berry pies, a little different. With frozen fruits, you're actually getting more moisture. You get all that condensation. And so you just want to make sure that you have the fruits beautifully coated in your thickener and whatever else you're filling. It's like sugar usually, sometimes little spices. And I'll show you how I thicken my berry pies, and they always come out beautifully where I cut them and they don't get runny, but they're not stodgy and weird where it feels like you just put a load of cornstarch in your mouth.
Michelle has a question.
Ask away.
Let's say you blind bake and let it cool and decide that you didn't bake it long enough.
Yeah.
Can it go back into the oven to get it where it should have been and still keep its flakiness?
Yeah, you can. I mean, at that point you have par baked at least the edges where it's going to keep its texture. Now, if you got puff and then you took it out and then some of the puff went down and you don't put it immediately back in with a filled ingredient, it's not going to puff back up. But if you kind of set the edges, you'll be fine. I mean, I would rather have a non-soggy bottom than not. And you'll still have a crispy crust. It'll be fine. It'll still be flaky, and the top will be flaky as well. So just go ahead and do it. It won't be as flaky had you done everything else.
Stacy has a question.
Ask Stacy. I know you get stuff from the fridge.
Okay. Why does her pie crust crack like crazy when she rolls it out? It ends up slightly resembling the continent of Europe. No bueno.
No bueno. I agree. Well, so one thing you can do is if you saw us making the pie dough when I was doing the frisage, what I call smushing, you can see that it's properly hydrated, and that this is the one we made, that you'll see the lovely, lovely bits of butter. Refrigerated for 20 minutes. And so right now this is looking great to me. Look, I know that when I roll it out that it's not going to crack because I can feel the hydration, but it's not overhydrated. The other thing could be that it's just too cold. When a dough is too cold, it cracks like crazy. So you've got to kind of take the two things into account. You don't want the dough warm so that it's melting as you're rolling it out, but you don't want it like brick ice cold because it's going to crack, period. So I think this is nice temperature, but I can still make an impression. It could even be a little colder, but look at that. I can make an impression and I'll know. So that's a hydration thing and a coolness. And go gently as you go around. Just gentle, gentle, gentle. I keep turning it. And I'll see little cracks. That's not a big deal. No big whoop.
Beth has a question.
Beth, ask.
She lives in Southwest Virginia and doesn't have air conditioning. Then she writes, if I can't get my kitchen below 80 degrees, should I just wait for cooler weather to attempt pie baking?
Yeah, you can, or you can just do a lot of hopping back and forth to the fridge. You can also roll out on a sheet pan that you've put in the freezer. So if you want to do things, we all do pies in steps, right? So you're going to roll out your dough. Once you've made it, use all the cold stuff. Use the frozen flour, cold butter, really cold glaze on your food processor. Get the dough into the refrigerator really quickly, and then freeze a sheet pan. And then when you roll out the dough, put a little bit of the flour on the sheet pan and roll out on that. If you have a marble, not a lot of people do, but if you do have a marble rolling pin, put that in the refrigerator. And you can do little things to kind of keep your dough at that temperature where it's going to create that really flaky crust. But I know it's such a pain, it is such a pain to have to fight the weather.
Yeah, Denise in Puerto Rico has the same kind of situation.
So it is a dance. And
Humidity.
It is humidity, and that's the other thing. You're going to want to play with a measure of water. And I know it's so frustrating for bakers when you're doing bread and pie dough, where you see in the recipe, half a cup of water, and you go, I put a half a cup of water in, it's like, ugh. Here's the thing, is humidity really does add its mark to all of your doughs. If you make sugar candies, and do any kind of sugar work, you know that you can't make divinity in the middle of July. So it's the same thing for doughs. Use less water. Know that dough still hydrates in the refrigerator, So if you're like nervous, you're like, I think it's there, but I'm not sure. As it's resting in the refrigerator, it's hygroscopic, that flour. It's kind of sucking up that moisture. So it's still going to hydrate while it's in the refrigerator. And it's going to get that lovely, lovely texture that you want in rolling out the dough, but won't overhydrate it from really high humidity places.
Karen wants to know if you've ever soaked them the night before in brown sugar, I guess the apples.
Oh, soak them in brown sugar? You know, I haven't, and you know, sugar is hygroscopic, so what it does, as you've done that, what it does is it'll start leaching the moisture from the apples, which is kind of a nice way to, if you don't want to saute the apples, of getting some of the moisture out through the sugar, but I haven't. I have done, I've poached for strudels, the apples, but no, I haven't soaked them. I have soaked raisins in alcohol. That doesn't count. So what I'm going to do is a little lattice crusty. I'm just going to start it. So if you have trouble with lattice crusts, I'm going to show you the way. With a quick demo.
A lot of questions
A
now.
lot of questions. Keep going. Ask away.
Confused.
It's okay.
Patricia wants to know if you use frangipane or creme pat
Yeah.
to match some of the moisture, I guess.
You could. I mean, using a pastry cream is not going to help with moisture. Frangipane would, because it bakes a little more thickly. But you could add a pastry cream. I do that for strudels. One thing you can do for moisture is the cream is going to be the cream is going to be the cream, and it's going to set up nicely. What we do in Germany, which is a trick, and this is actually a recycling tip as well. As you're baking cakes, if your cakes dome and you level them off, break them up, put them in the freezer, and you can add them to pie fillings. If you crumble them up, you put them in the food processor and you crumble them up, add about half a cup to a cup. And what that does, it will soak up some of that moisture, and it will dissipate a little, create great flavor and thickness without adding like that floury stodginess to it. But it's also a nice way of recycling cake that you would otherwise eat that second. So that's one way of doing it.
Kathleen wants to know, pot pies, should those crusts be blind baked too?
I do. If I do, I like to do bottom and top pot pie crusts because I'm a crusty baby. And I do blind bake them because I want to be able to go in there and not get a smush on the bottom, because you know when you make pot pies with chicken, you're like, was that chicken or a crust that I just ate? So yeah, I do blind bake them. Also a comedy show. So I'm doing a little lattice crust, and I eyeball it as I go. One thing that is crucial for lattice crusts is that people are like, they don't look perfect. When I measure them out, it seems like they're perfect, but as I start working, the strips get wonky. Yes, they do. So as you're working, I'm gonna go over here. I put a little flour down. And then I start and I already know that this is too far apart. I'll get them closer. And it's important that your pieces of dough are relatively well chilled. So as I'm doing this, it's hot outside, it's summer. If I start moving my pieces of dough around and they start feeling sticky at all, I will put this on a piece, well, it's already on parchment. I will put it on a sheet pan and put it in the refrigerator right away to stiffen them up so I can manhandle them more easily. So I'm going to do this and do this. They're still cool right now. And you can see that they're a little wonky, but I can work with that as I'm making the lattice. So I am doing 4 of the larger pieces and about 10 of these smaller pieces.
Patricia wants to know who's doing your camera work, your husband?
My husband is doing the camera work. and providing commentary along the way. Give him a hand. Yay, Ray! Okay, so that's going to be the outer edge, and now we're going to start working on the lattice itself. And again, as I'm working, if I'm feeling that any bit of this is getting too smushy, too warm, I'm going to move all of my dough into the refrigerator. So now I'm going to start at the middle. Every other one pops up. And this is, it does get confusing. As you're working along, you're like, what have I just done? Who am I? What am I? So, see? I'm already confused. So I put this one in the middle to start me off. Always making sure that these little pieces are feeling cool enough that I can move them around without them losing shape. So those can, now these are going to flip up.
You ever travel to California to teach classes, Karen wants to know?
I have, but not as often as I would like. Hopefully in the future, let's make that happen. I will be teaching, and this is so not California, I will be teaching at Stonewall Kitchen in Maine next year. So if you're in Maine, so why don't you come to Maine? They'll be gorgeous. And so as you're doing this, I like my lattice a little tighter. And so I make sure at this point that this middle section is as tight as I want it to be, because that's the hardest section to correct once you're going. Does that make sense? So now I'm going to be doing this. Now, if I were to feel that this was too warm and I wanted to put it in the refrigerator, you're also going to want to check another thing, that it doesn't get so cold that as you are bending your dough back and forth, that it cracks because it's too cold. That can happen too, and that's such a bummer because exactly where it cracks is where it will show on the outside of the lattice. We all know that that's a big stinker. Now, to me, to my mind, it's not looking perfect. I want it to be a little more uniform. So what I would do is I wouldn't mess with it now because this has been sitting around and I know that it's going to get warmer and warmer, and that if I start moving my pieces around, that it's not going to look, it's actually going to start looking worse. So what I would do is I would finish up my lattice, and then I would refrigerate it until it's relatively stiff, and only then, when I know everything is feeling not rock hard, but you know, stiff, so it's not going to lose its shape, I will get a dull edge knife, and right before I put it on my top crust, I will start moving the pieces around until they're as uniform as I'd like them to be. I will chill it again if I'm being really persnickety, and then so that it's cold when I put it on top of my filling, so that if it moves at all when it's on the filling, I will have a chance to move it again and look its best once it's baking.
Sadie wants to know if the thin pieces will brown out faster than the bigger pieces.
Not really. No, they tend not to. I usually do a uniform egg wash with sugar on it, so it will, the parts that brown less are the ones that are usually closest to the filling, not necessarily the thinner or the thicker pieces. So this is the lattice that I'm going to put. Usually I do a little more, but for our sakes, I'm just going to transfer. See? And the reason I put flour down is that I want it to be able, when it's nice and cold, I'm going to transfer that to the top of a filled pie. I want it to move easily without the lattice work coming apart. That's important. I've got frozen berries. And I'm going to fill a pie.
How long do you want to do this?
So we're just going to fill this and I'll show you more about the lattice. So what I do to thicken a frozen fruit pie, oh, we've got an hour, guys. Exciting. I use about a half a cup of sugar, a quarter cup of instant clear gel, King Arthur flour, and then I mix them together. You have to whisk them together, otherwise the clear gel tends to clump if it's not wonderfully whisked into the sugar. So I add that to about 7 to 8 cups of frozen berries. Don't thaw them. Do it when they're dead frozen. Now what I tend to do is, I might not need all of this. I can save this for later if I don't use all of it, because I don't want to have this clump of starch-filled sugar at the bottom of my pie. I just want all the berries coated, so that looks good. So I still have some left over that I can put in a little Ziploc and use later.
Gigi wants to know what's instant clear gel.
Instant clear gel is a thickener, is a pie thickener that is a combination of some citric acid, a thickener, a cornstarch-based thickener, and that's pretty much it. But one thing has been formulated so that when it bakes, especially in berries, it doesn't leave them cloudy. And it has enough citric acid in that you don't have to add lemon or anything like that to add that little lovely flavor to it either. But you do have to add sugar. But it's my favorite thickener because, especially for berry pies, they stay lovely and clear and shiny and they don't get that weird cloudiness to them.
What if she doesn't have it?
If you don't have it, you can use cornstarch. Usually I make a slurry, so about a quarter cup of cornstarch with a little bit of lemon juice and just enough water to make it a nice paste. And then I will add that to the whole business. Okay. So let's see. So you can see here, this is a cake lifter that I put this lattice crust on. And it's nice and cold enough that it just goes on top. So now my lattice is on, and now I can make small adjustments, right? And I'm going to get my scissors, and I'm just going to follow, bing, along. And at this kind of junction, I just press down to make sure that it doesn't decide to part on me. You just follow the line. Just keep going around. So this is why I say you have to be really patient with lattice, in that if you want it to be perfect and have those, that like really measured spaces where it looks like it's been evenly applied, then just take your time, make sure that the dough is chilled enough that you can move things around without losing your perfect cuts. Because that's one of the things that you think you've cut everything perfectly, and then the second the dough starts getting warm, it loses its shape, it gets wonky, it gets bigger, blech, it starts stretching. So just be patient. It's tough in the summer, but that's when we make most pies, which kind of stuff. So just keep going back and forth to the refrigerator. That's what I did with this lattice. I just went back and forth until I was happy. And there we go with the lattice. And so since we have, and I will save these pieces. And since we have a double crust, and I might just want these edges to be a little prettier, I will get some egg wash, which is an egg and some water. Boop, boop, boop. And I'll just go along the edges first. And this is just a little leaf cookie cutter. Same dough. And this was from Extras. You know how I didn't use all the dough when I did the bottom crust? This is that dough from leftover bottom crust. Oh, stay. And it will, I do this a little more thinly, about 1/8 of an inch thick when I roll it out. You can overlap them if you like. This also creates a nice roundness to it in case the lattice, when you cut it, there are little bits that are angular. You can cover up spots, like say part of your crust is cracking in the middle, shove a bunch of leaves in the middle. Say you did it on purpose, no one will know. If you're worried about the bottom lattice attaching to the lime baked bottom, you can put a little bit of egg wash on the baked bottom before you put on the lattice top, and then press down gently. Okay. And so to finish this off, I'm going to put egg wash over everything. And then I like to, you can do it just like this, no egg wash, and it will come out a little more blonde when it's baked. I prefer a little golden. So I put egg wash, which browns it just a little. And then I put on sugar in the raw on top. And this is so illegal. Sometimes if you're not making a lot of pie, and I usually get sugar in the raw in bulk, and that's a lot of sugar in the raw if you're not going to be using it all the time. Next time you go to Starbucks, put a couple of those packets in your pocket the next time you make pie. I did not say that on camera, so I didn't say to do anything illegal. Ha-ha! But totally do it. Totally do it. I do it all the time. Here's another trick. So there was a little crack in a bit of this lattice, so I will put a little extra egg wash on there, right there, and I will just make sure that I hit that hard with sugar so that all the sparkle will take away from the fact that there was a itty bitty crack in my dough. And then here we go. And you can use any kind of sanding sugar, one that is nice and white. The great thing about sanding sugar is that it doesn't brown in the oven. So for holidays you could use red, green, whatever you want. So it's kind of a nice way to decorate with color without having to do a lot of serious piping work or anything crazy skillful. So there we are. That's a pretty good looking double crusted pie. This will go into the oven and we'll eat it later. And thank you so much for joining us. If you have any more questions, leave them in the comment section. I will get back to you and I will answer. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. Bye, sweet people.